All right. Well, welcome to the podcast. My name is Gianni, and I work here at the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. And I'm here with Jaap, our executive director. And I'd like to welcome Rupert Sheldrake to the podcast. Rupert is a PhD, is a biologist and author, best known for his hypothesis of morphic resonance. At Cambridge University, he worked in developmental biology as a Fellow of Clare College. He was a principal plant physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in Hyderabad, India. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of the Perot-Warwick Project for research on unexplained human and animal abilities, funded by Trinity College, Cambridge. Dr. Sheldrake's most well-known collaboration with Krishnamurti is the Nature of the Mind series, which was filmed here in Pine Cottage in 1982, in which Dr. Sheldrake met with Krishnamurti, David Bohm, and John Hidley to discuss the roots of psychological disorder and psychological suffering.
Yeah, if I may take that as a starting point. And of course, we're here in the same space, and it's almost 40 years ago that you were here and had these discussions. And for the people who read Krishnamurti, who read his work and look at the videos, that set of discussions have quite a prominence, especially because it somehow delves deeply into the psyche of the human being, the nature of the mind, and what the root causes are of suffering. And I reread the transcripts of these talks just before we started, and I see you making a journey there throughout the four discussions. It starts with almost looking what is suffering, what is the difference between suffering between humans and animals. Then it goes a little bit into what's an image and why do we defend ourselves, and identification and security. And at a specific point, it's about the ground of humanity, right? Are we all the same, or are we different? And what is the level of differences, and what's the level of sameness? And what I would like to ask you to start with is, could you somehow say, now looking back upon that, and now 40 years have passed, would you have run that discussion in a different way? What have you learned, or what are you seeing differently, or what information do we have that's different, that somehow would inform or put a different light on the issues discussed at that time?
Well, I'm not sure that I would see it very differently, actually. I mean, I wasn't really running the discussion. I mean, it was a real discussion. And, the Krishnaji was, and David Bohm, I hadn't met Hidley before, but Krishnaji and David Bohm had very definite points of view. And so the discussion would always have worked within the framework of what they were thinking and what they discussed. And that imposed certain restraints on how one could discuss it, because on Krishnamurti's agenda, traditional religions were definitely a taboo area. And so that meant that the sort of big part of the discussion was removed, or at least one could only talk in slightly abstract terms. So I think that the general conclusions about suffering and the mind and the interconnection of humanity still remain.
Mm-hmm.
What one can actually do about it is another question. And Krishnamurti had a very definite view on how one should not proceed rather than how one should proceed, because he was very careful not to be prescriptive and tell people what to do.
Why was that, you think? How did you translate it, or how did you see his position?
Well, I saw his position as reactive, actually, because he'd been brought up in the Theosophical Society. I stayed at Ojai, and I've often been to that part of the world. I used to work in India, and indeed, I used to meet Krishnaji in India for several years running. He was in Ojai while I was in South India. We used to meet there. We had several dialogues in Ojai and several in Delhi as well. And I think his reaction against the Theosophical Society and the role that was projected onto him by Mrs. Besant and Ledbetter created this kind of almost permanent reactive stance in relation to any form of organized religion or organized activity. So in that sense, he was a kind of spiritual anarchist and was opposed to any kind of organization. But when I was living in South India, I spent 2 years living in a Benedictine ashram with Father Bede Griffiths, and I wasn't opposed to tradition and organization. In fact, I found it very helpful. So I came from a very different position from Krishnamurti. And I found that his reactive position against religion was always to reject gurus, to reject dogma, etc. And I found actually, when I was having lunch with him right where you are now in that same house once, and I asked whether he'd actually studied anything about, recent developments in Christian theology or anything like that. And he said, no. He said, I watch these televangelists on television. He said, and they're appalling. And then he started talking about just how appalling they were. So his knowledge of the Christian tradition seemed to be principally derived from watching the very worst kind of American televangelists. So it wasn't a very well-informed discussion when it came to the role of religion in dealing with these things. And because he didn't want to create an alternative religion, because he wanted people to inquire in their own way, he didn't really offer much of a method. I mean, I tried to work out what his method was. Partly it was not dissociating ourselves from our emotions. Instead of, I am angry, as if anger is something just comes to one. I am anger. That it's the being present in one's emotions. So part of his method was that, as far as I could tell. But I think that many people who were lifelong followers of his, used to go year after year to listen to his discourses, actually wanted some kind of method, and he didn't give them one. So I think that many of them felt somewhat lost. Yeah. That was my impression, because they knew what they shouldn't do, and that was follow any religion or any guru or any method, but they didn't know what they should do. And it was awfully hard for most people to work it out for themselves. Yeah. And I think they went back to listen to Krishnamurti over and over again because they were hoping that somehow something would come through of what they actually could do.
Yeah, so somewhere he would allude to some method or something. That's the hope or something, right?
Something like that. That at some stage it would become clear, how this enlightenment could be communicated and how this state. Because his general view was that it's there already, you only have to realize it. It's not unlike the Dzogchen view in Tibetan Buddhism. Yeah. But the Dzogchen people do provide some kind of method. Apart from anything else, they have the direct transmission of Rigpa, from a teacher to the disciple. They have this direct insight. So I thought that was the biggest problem, actually, with Krishnaji, that he was wonderful at giving a kind of inspiring talk. I think when he was talking, sitting under trees in the oak grove or under a banyan tree in Adyar, he was a real rishi. He was transmitting. It was a kind of seer. And I think that's what drew people to him. But what he transmitted was, as I say, it was very elusive for most people. Yeah. Well, it certainly was for me.
Could I just, for the sake of argument, or just for the sake of drawing some contrast here, because I understand his position to be that there's like the humans have a capability. That's a potential, and the potential is somehow not being fulfilled, or it's not happening. The humans don't grow into their full potential. Or flower, he would use to use flowering a lot. And he said the main culprit in that, he called that in generally authority. That if you somehow cease to look for yourself, so I somehow sometimes think, well, the outer religions were somehow a minimal distraction, but it's somehow the inner had the internally assuming something to be true and then cease to look where really the issues seem to be. I wonder how you see that. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, again, you see, Krishnaji was very ambiguous because though he questioned authority, his followers treated him as an authority. Mm-hmm. Although he said, I am not a guru, he was treated very much like a guru. And so there was a kind of ambiguity that he was an authority and he was a teacher. And there are all these books and videos and things in which his teachings and his meetings at which he communicated these teachings. So he was an authority. And the question is, to what degree, how is it best to empower people if the goal is that people go on a spiritual quest? Yes, all religions have a kind of mystical side to them, and all of them have a non-mystical side. You know, in India, you can just go to a temple and do a puja without getting into any mystical state. But then there are all these sadhus and sannyasins and people meditating in caves who are into the more mystical side of it. Within Christianity, there are a lot of people who just go to church and probably pray a bit themselves, but aren't into sort of lengthy contemplative practices. But there are contemplative nuns and monks who spend hours a day in contemplative meditation in convents and monasteries. So this is present in every religion as an option.
You're somehow saying, like, if I understand you correctly, like the mystical side is the most important side, because that's where the potentiality of the human lies, right? And that the organized religion itself, in your view, does not necessarily detract from that. But so if we're saying the mystical side is the most important one, so how do you nurture that, right? Because that's then the central question. I mean, if we leave the other aspects out, because especially the times we live in now, that seems to be the most important question. Like, how do we nurture the human, as you call it, mysticism, or that element?
Well, I mean, this is where, again, I differ from Krishnaji. I mean, I've recently written 2 books. One is called Science and Spiritual Practices, and the second one, the most recent, is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And each of these books is about 7 different spiritual practices. In other words, practices that one can actually do, which are more likely to bring about a kind of mystical sense of connection or going beyond the normal mundane mind. And the practices are quite varied. In Science and Spiritual Practice, I discuss meditation and various meditative methods, including scientific studies of them. Gratitude, the practice of gratitude, is now well established through scientific research to make people feel happier and more connected. Petitionary prayer, fasting, the observation of festivals and holy days, the chanting and singing, which can change people's states and link them to each other. Rituals, which I think have a power that comes from the morphic resonance. I mean, that's where my own ideas come in here. So anyway, there's altogether 14 different spiritual practices, which I've written about in these books, which have been studied scientifically, not in a way that's trying to debunk them, but the science actually enhances one's understanding. The study of meditation, for example, shows its effects on well-being, reducing stress, making people sleep better, changes in brain activity, even changes in brain anatomy in long-term meditators like Tibetan monks.
So it's interesting how you're this is your interest and that you write books about. At the time, you had that strong interest, or you had at least the action to meet the man who manifested completely the opposite. So what was the attraction there for you?
Well, I liked Krishnamurti. We got on very well. I think we became good friends. And I think that I enjoyed talking to him because I like talking about these things. And also, I quite enjoy talking to people when we have a difference of opinion and when it's possible to have a conversation, a discussion. I don't say debate, because debates are where one side wins and the other side loses. And it wasn't that. It was a genuine dialogue. And one of his standard lines in his talks was, come, sir, let us discuss it together. So I took him literally. I took him up on it. And I think one of the reasons that it wasn't just me seeking out Krishna. I was being invited by people like Mary Zimbalist and Pupal Jayaka in India and the people at Brockwood Park in England to take part in these dialogues with him. I mean, I was always going because I was invited. And the reason he was interested in me was because in 1981, my book, A New Science of Life, had just come out about the idea of morphic resonance. And Krishnaji liked the idea that all humanity is interconnected, something that happens in one person. He used to say, I am humanity. I'm connected with everyone. We're all connected with all humanity. So the idea that something that happened in one person could affect all the others at a distance is very similar to the idea of morphic resonance.
Yes.
So that was what brought us together in the first place. So followers of his in England wanted us to meet to discuss morphic resonance in relation to his ideas. But then I think I really enjoyed being with him. And not only when we were having the more formal discussions, but we used to go for walks together. And I used to tease him, and he quite liked that. So, most people were frightened of him.
Yeah.
And I wasn't frightened of him. I didn't think I was spiritually lost. I already had a teacher, Father Bede. I lived in an ashram. I had a spiritual practice. I had a daily spiritual practice. I didn't feel I was completely lost at sea and was clutching at straws. I felt fairly confident and fairly able to talk to him as he suggested people did. And I think that one reason that I was invited so often by his followers was precisely because I wasn't afraid of him. And so I was able to ask things that a lot of them wanted to ask but didn't dare. For example, he'd spend hours talking about how awful the state of the world was, how corrupt everything was, and so on, and how gloomy everything was. And then he'd say, what would happen? We need enlightenment and start. And yes. But then he also had this doctrine, if one person's enlightened, then all of humanity is enlightened. I am humanity. So I said to him, well, if so many people, if one person being enlightened could transform humanity, since you just told us humanity is very unreconstructed and untransformed, it suggests that not one person has yet become enlightened. Well, of course, his whole belief was that he had become enlightened. So then he said, well, maybe it takes more than one. So then I said, well, how many? 10, 100, 1,000. And he said, well, maybe 10. I said, well, then the world's in a terrible state, so obviously 10 haven't become enlightened yet. So he'd go to maybe 100 and maybe 1,000. Well, so then, it became a fun discussion. I mean, it was fun. It wasn't an argument. It was fun. I mean, he saw the fun in this. And then, but there was a serious point, because if he'd been teaching by then for 50 years, if humanity was still in this terrible state that he described, then clearly not enough people had become enlightened, whether the figure was 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000 or 100. He didn't ever commit himself to an actual figure. But despite all these years of his teaching, decades, this hadn't happened.
Yeah.
So this raised the serious question of, how would his method actually work in transforming humanity? And I think is a very open question. It's an open question for all religions and all spiritual traditions, because humanity is still in a mess. Yeah. And, there are terrible things happening everywhere. So there are good things happening too. But you don't get the feeling that enlightenment is engulfing the planet at the moment.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think about with morphic resonance being a sort of, like you say, probabilistic repetition, if I'm understanding that correctly. And, you talk about the laws of nature being more like habits, these sort of deeply entrenched habits, and we have things like conditioning. But I wonder, in the sense of morphic resonance, what in your research on it, in your views, what is the effect of change or transformation within it? I mean, you had an interesting sort of fun discussion you were saying with Krishnamurti about, does it take one person? Does it take 10 people? Does it take, is there some sort of a majority, 51% of a population of a species that both in turn draw upon this, if we want to call it collective unconscious or something like that? Is there, and I'm not expecting there to be a sort of a rigid number. I think that's part of the joke, but in your view and in your research, what is the role of change and transformation within a species?
Well, morphic resonance is a principle of habit formation and repetition. It says that once things have happened, the more often they happen, the more likely they are to happen again. In other words, it is, as you said, probabilistic. The more a habit's formed, the deeper the grooves of habit are. The force of habit is very strong. So it's good news and bad news for transformation, because bad news in the sense that deeply seated habits are very hard to change, and human beings have a lot of deep-seated habits, including now consumerism and the habits of not thinking about the environment, taking it for granted, and so forth. On the other hand, if new forms of behavior arise, then they can spread more quickly by morphic resonance than they might otherwise do. So morphic resonance could actually help in the acceleration of change. And that's the bit that Krishnamurti was most interested in and what we discussed. But it doesn't mean that everyone has to change, because to come into morphic resonance with someone or something, you have to be similar. So what it means is if say someone's doing a particular spiritual practice, like meditating in a particular way, by doing that meditation, they'll resonate with all the previous people who've used that mantra or that form of meditation. So there'll be a kind of collective memory of that meditation. In rituals, there'll be a kind of collective memory that comes through the ritual. So there's a power that comes through numbers, and if there, say, 1,000 people had become enlightened in the Krishnamurti manner, then that would make it easier for others to become enlightened in that way. But it wouldn't force everybody to become enlightened whether they liked it or not. These morphic resonance things are a bit like TV channels. There are dozens, hundreds of TV channels. And you can increase the strength of a signal. You can increase the strength of a particular, like BBC One television. You could increase the strength of the signal and mean more people could pick it up over a wider area. But it wouldn't force everyone to put their tuning knob onto BBC One. They might be on another channel or one of the many, many other channels. So this morphic resonance doesn't force people to tune into a particular pattern or channel of human activity. Another example is languages. If it was just based on numbers, then everyone in the world, the babies would sort of be born and start speaking English because it's the most predominant language, or Mandarin, or some other Chinese language, or Spanish. But that's not what happens. There are hundreds and hundreds of languages. And when babies are being brought up in a family, they tune into the language that's being spoken around them, and morphic resonance accelerates their learning of it. But it doesn't force them to learn one rather than another. So I think that it means that if people are seeking a spiritual path and seeking a particular way of doing something and start doing it, a particular practice, then morphic resonance will help them. Or if they start thinking in a new way, then, and lots of other people have thought that way, morphic resonance will help that process. So it's very relevant to these spiritual things, but it doesn't mean there'd be an automatic transformation of humanity, whether people like it or not.
I see. And so I wonder, you mentioned that in your book you speak about the morphic resonance of ritual, and you talk about the sense of connecting into a particular channel. I guess I wonder, and I've heard of those studies about, people who've been meditating, and they do the brain scans of the sort of state of the brain or the mind. And so I guess I wonder, in that sense, when people tune in, what exactly is going on at that level, and is it something that's a connection amongst the community that you're in the sort of participation that you have with others, or is it also something that you're connecting? I know you speak in your paper about the way that morphic resonance can transcend time and space, in the sense of from the past to the present. And so is there some sort of deeper archetypal connection? Is that what you're suggesting, or?
Well, yes, I think that there's a deeper, well, in a ritual, morphic resonance depends on similarity. The more similar a pattern of activity in the past to something in the present, the greater the resonance. And the whole point of rituals is that they're done in a very similar way. The Brahminic rituals of India, for example, are done in Sanskrit, and the chanting is the standard old form of chanting. And the way the ritual's performed means that those who do it or take part in it now are brought together with others who are taking part now, but they're also in resonance with all those who've done it before. So there's a connection across time. And spiritual practices are about connection. They're about connection with forms of consciousness beyond our own, or beyond our own limited consciousness. They're about connection with other people, which is why all religions have a collective dimension as well as an individual dimension. And the mystical pursuit about which we were talking earlier is a more individual aspect. But all of us have to be sustained by communities. We live in communities, and we have to have families, and not everyone in a family is, especially young children, aren't going to be in hours of meditation a day in mystical states. And in order to sustain communities, we have to have holy days and festivals and celebrations together. That's what binds together communities, celebrations, including ritual celebrations like weddings and funerals and christenings or other naming ceremonies. And so these rituals and the observation of the collective aspect of religion helps to connect us with other members of our society, our social group. Whereas if it's just individual meditation in a quiet room on one's own, it misses that collective dimension, which is why I think one of the reasons I like religious traditions, while admitting they can be abused and debased and fundamentalized, but why I think they're important is they recognize both the individual dimension, the more mystical individual practice, and the importance of the collective dimension, celebrating together, singing together, doing rituals together, and connecting us with those who've gone before, our ancestors. And unless we have a link in all normal societies, it's taken for granted that we need to acknowledge those who've gone before. We live in connection with the ancestors. And so in the Christian tradition, the celebration of the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day, November the 2nd, is the ritual celebration of the ancestors and the dead. A big thing in Mexico. But it's present in Catholic tradition all over the world, and also the Anglican tradition.
Can I ask you, if I hear you correctly, and I'm just trying to, because for time-wise, I try to frame it somehow. Like, what I understand from Krishnamurti is that he felt very concerned about humanity, right? I mean, somewhere he says his purpose was to set humanity absolutely, unconditionally free. Now we're here. I clearly feel that also what you're describing, what you just was describing, and what you're writing about, it's that you somehow also feel somewhat of a concern for the human race or for the human species as a whole. So at this point of time where you see the challenges, the current challenges of the humanity, the political challenges on one hand, the climate challenges, the sociological challenges, the the religious challenges. What do you feel is, having looked, of course, at your own approach, which is various systems and methods, and Krishnamurti's approach, which is no system, no method. So, what is the responsible thing to do at the moment for humanity in order to bring all these crises to turn it around in a different direction for not for our ancestry, but for the ones who are coming after us?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a huge question, and I wish I had a simple answer. But I think that one of the things you see that one of the problems in the present crisis is that the dominant philosophy, which has now conquered the whole world, is mechanistic materialism. The idea that nature is dead, inanimate, and unconscious and purposeless, that science has revealed, or materialistic assumptions. It's not really that science has revealed it, but people think that. This is the theme of my book, Science Set Free, called The Science Delusion in England. It's become a dogmatic belief system which treats us as totally separate from nature and separate from each other. Our minds, nothing but the activity of our brains, insulated inside our skulls, not connected with other minds except through speech, writing, and actions. And we live in a universe which is completely pointless material, made of pointless matter, no consciousness and no purpose. And the only thing that counts then, and there's no afterlife, and there's nothing beyond this life, and nothing beyond our bodily existence. So then the main thing that counts is being consumers and having pleasures. And so we have a consumptive culture based on consumption. And the fact that a third of the world's population are obese or overweight means this is literally the case. We have a literally over-consuming style of life, which is burning up the Earth's resources, destroying the planet for greed and consumption. We also have a secular society, at least growingly in America and largely in Europe, and spreading over the world through materialist education and modern Western secularist ideals, which removes all morality from the public domain, really, at least removes makes it privatized. The spiritual dimension is totally privatized. The public domain is about, maximizing profits, corporate activity, government facilitating educational systems that help the economic system, and so on. So I think that one of the principal things that's needed is to find a new goal, to reestablish different ways of goals and aspirations, so that people are not looking always to earn more money. They're not going to earn more money anyway. I mean, young people have to lower their sights. They're going to be worse off than their parents in most cases. So it can't just be about money, consumption, production, gross national product. There have to be other things that make human life satisfying. And all traditional societies have recognized those. One is celebration together. That's why the Jewish tradition of the Sabbath is so important. Of course, it's on Sunday for Christians, Fridays for Muslims. But the idea is there's a special day when you don't work and when you can just hang out together, be with your family, make love, feast, enjoy nature, sing together, worship God. That's very important. And that's been wiped out by 24/7 culture. So I think that restoring these ways of being, living more harmoniously with the world, and having a collective, not just an individual, some kind of collective spiritual aspiration, which could be to live in harmony with nature, would be very different. You see, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the aim of the society was to work for the glory of God, not to increase human consumption. And what that has left behind for us to enjoy still today are these incredible Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Lincoln and Salisbury. These astonishing cathedrals, which were the product of a time when there was very little technology, much lower population. Their aspiration was to create things of great beauty for the glory of God. Our aspiration is to increase consumption and the power of corporations and the profits of the rich, and with no concern for the harmony of the earth or living in harmony with it. So we have to shift the general goals, and therefore they have to be more spiritual goals.